It's another day in America. Another day in America. Welcome to the America at 250 podcast, devoted to enabling us to see and feel America through the eyes and hearts of others, and as a result, take concrete steps to make America truly great. I'm Kevin Caldwell. And in order to pursue the purpose of this podcast, throughout the project, I'll be inviting a very diverse set of guests to share how they would answer what would make America great. It only seems fitting during this year in which America turns 250. Unanswered questions, 250 years and counting, we're still waiting in America. Well, welcome back, everyone, to the America at 250 podcast and my second interview with Tamara Lanier. And if you've missed the first one, which would be episode 6, if you're following chronologically, I'd really encourage you to go back and listen to that. In that, we covered a lot of ground, the whole story of, well, not the whole story, but at least some glimpses into the story of Tamara's battle with Harvard over really her family legacy. But in many ways, that's just a small window into legacy issues in America and the legacy we have of slavery and enslaved peoples that still casts its shadows not just on us but in us as a people. And so we touched on all sorts of things relative to that. We touched on relational things. We touched on ancestral lineage. We touched on Harvard. We touched on the legal battle a bit. We introduced a few characters. We talked about science in the service of racism, science with air quotes for those of you who are listening, pseudoscience, and Lord knows we're surrounded by pseudoscience and fake news today. And so I think it's really appropriate that we're having this conversation, and I'm looking forward to continuing it. We will be touching on things like recovery of legacy and lineage. We'll be talking about relationships and reconciliation, and we'll be talking about the sort of thorny, difficult conversation around reparations. We'll get to all of that, but I want to start first. For our listeners, as we're sitting to record this, Tamara, tomorrow is July 1. 2026, which means in this weekend, a lot of Americans are going to be getting fireworks and having block parties and going to look at fireworks. There's a lot of hurrah, hurrah for the greatness of America, etc. And while I do want to celebrate good things, I want to have a grateful heart for the good things, I'm very aware that for many of my friends, it is a really strange, mixed, at least mixed, if not worse than mixed kind of season, especially this America at 251, because of all the emphasis in the current administration on making America great again without ever telling us what period of history they want to go back to. But we can kind of guess what it would look like. It would look mainly like me, old white guys, in power. So without getting into all that, just I've been asking my friends who are part of these interviews, what's it like for you as this 250th celebration, quote unquote, gets closer and closer, and all the rhetoric that's surrounding it? What's it like for you?
I am reminded of an essay that was written by Frederick Douglass. Very, very powerful essay. Very, very thought-provoking and really revelatory in its messaging. But it's entitled, "What Does the 4th of July Mean to the Negro?" And it puts things in perspective. The hypocrisy, the idiocy, the notion that, when he's writing this essay, the world or the country is celebrating freedom, and he's still burdened in slavery.
What year did he write that in? Do you recall?
I'm not certain, but I know that slavery was still a thing.
So pre-Civil War, or at least pre-conclusion, Emancipation Proclamation. Yeah.
I would
Thank you. Yeah.
but I don't want to speculate. I can search and find that for you.
That's okay. Yeah.
But it's the notion of like cognitive dissonance, like or gaslighting. How do we celebrate and how do we memorialize this event, the 4th of July, without acknowledging that while most of the country was celebrating freedom, another half of the country was still enslaved. And we ignored that as if it didn't happen. And I think that's what we did in the 1800s, the mid 1800s. And this is what we're doing now.
Yeah.
We can't give true credibility to the holiday without telling the true story.
Yeah.
The whole and one of the things that it also reminded me of, or reminds me of, is I had a conversation with a Harvard student from South Africa, and she talked about the end of apartheid and the process of repair began and ended with the notion of not only reconciliation, but truth first and then reconciliation. You can't have the reconciliation without truth telling. And this is something we seem to have. I don't want to say we've lost sight of it. I don't think this country has ever had sight of the fact.
Yes, you have to have sight to lose sight. Yes. Yeah.
I don't think we've ever really looked seriously at owning the slavery in a way that we acknowledge it truthfully, that we tell these stories truthfully, and that we heal, we reconcile, and we heal from that. And this is where we're stuck. So what does the 4th of July mean to me? I am an American citizen. I am free, and I celebrate that. But there's a part that laments to say, but that's not the whole story. We're not the whole story. And 250 years ago, when we were celebrating our independence and my enslaved ancestors were still in bondage.
Yep.
So a fragmented perspective on it. Like I said, I'm an American citizen. I bring my independence, but also I'm a descendant of American chattel slavery.
Yes.
And part of my legacy and my history is not being properly told.
Yeah. And I think that cognitive dissonance, as you just pointed out, it goes all the way back to the Declaration of Independence and the framers. The cognitive dissonance was already in that room.
Yes.
I've called it fault lines, but it's that I love the phrase cognitive dissonance, and I think that's exactly what it is. And we actually need it. We need to face that.
We do, and in other countries who have done this same healing work have recognized that you can't move forward in the dark. You can't move forward by denying a big part of the history that got us to where we are today.
Yeah, you mentioned South Africa. I think that's a great example. A lot of work was done in that period, and clearly still needs to be done there. But because it's a long process, in a former life, I used to travel a lot in East Africa and in the Great Lakes region of Africa, and particularly in Rwanda after major genocide there, basically, which goes back to Belgian colonial roots and the way Western powers turned the other eye, all that kind of stuff. But my point is, it's another example of what you're talking about. They post-genocide, when they could have just said, okay, we're just not going to do this anymore, let's put the people who were wronged in jail, etc. They could have just smoothed over, but they actually brought perpetrators and victims together and talked it through. And that takes maturity and Man, but what a difference it would make if we could do that.
Yes. And, and this is where we're lacking in terms of leaders with the courage to say, to acknowledge that this is not the right way forward.
Right.
And this is, and you see, like the celebration of Juneteenth and President Biden, declaring that a holiday. Beautiful thing. It really is. But it was at a time when the country was calling for reparations and the discussions about reparations. Certainly we'll take the holiday. It is a holiday. But you fail to address the question in that moment is, what are you going to do to repair the harm caused by slavery?
Yeah. Yeah, in a prior interview with Joey Williams talking about First Nations, one of the things that came up was it's kind of a trend now, especially in California, I assume elsewhere in the United States, but in California where I'm most familiar, it's a trend to open a meeting with a land acknowledgement.
Yes.
And he was like, that's great.
Mm-hmm.
But what are those people, like if an organization is giving a land acknowledgement, are they giving a portion of their budget to a First Nations people and their needs? Are they just something, right? To say that we're not just performatively kind of saying, oh yes, this is terrible. Okay, let's move on with our agenda.
Yes. And now that let's move on. And if there is no action,
yeah.
Faith without good works is dead. If there's action behind that, if this is great messaging, right. But where's
the beef used to be the commercial, right? For that dates me, listeners. Those of you who are young are like, what? Where'd that come from? But it's an old commercial, so yeah, and I'm an old guy, so. But so I think, and of course we're in a time right now where the opposite of truth telling is actually happening. The opposite of facing. We're seeing historical references to slavery removed from national parks and and websites, and people of color are being removed from historical accounts, and it's the opposite actually of what you're talking about.
And the despair that I feel, because beyond, and this seems to be trending now. It's like every time I turn around, I see another attack on truth telling and telling after history. And I get the politics, but what's so hurtful and so un-American and so unconstitutional is when the Supreme Courts uphold this foolishness. And so there was, I guess, recently, and I apologize, I don't recall what national park there was an exhibit that included references to enslaved people, and it was taken down.
Yep.
And there was a challenge to that. That erasure of history, that attempt to marginalize the enslaved people and celebrate the enslavers. And you would think reasonable minds, when they hear this, will say, okay, this is a fact of history that happens.
Right.
Why would the courts go along with erasing that, removing that, disqualifying that? And that's where I seem to feel like I know that, after the darkness, there'll be dawn, and we will rebuild and we will repair. But the one thing that troubles me is beyond the next 2 years, and beyond the next administration, is the work that the harm that has been done to the courts, to the Constitution, to civil rights, to human rights. That is going to be more than 2 years to repair.
Yes.
Take some time to, you think about Reconstruction after slavery. We are going to have or need a major Reconstruction period. after this administration.
Yeah.
But go, like people say, we will rebuild, and we will move forward, and we will, undo all the harm that has been caused. But, there's one sad reality. The court, in current composition, is not going to be fixed overnight.
No, it's not. And, it's not that we're wishing for death, right? But it's just acknowledging, right, that it's like in LA when not the most recent Boyle Heights fires, but the fires especially in Altadena, and Pacific Palisades. Palisades got most of the press because it was rich white people mostly. Altadena got the back news because it was much more mixed in terms of it was lower economic and more mixed in terms of people of color, and the air quality actually cleared up fairly quickly, but the toxins are in the soil, right? And so reparation takes time. The toxins sink down, and it takes time. So, and we've been talking kind of at this big, really important but big level. I'm going to bring us down to some of the personal interactions that you tell about in your book. And by the way, again, for listeners who are new, the book I'm referring to, and it's also in the podcast description, is From These Roots. You can find it wherever you buy your books. I'm not going to name any evil empires that are selling books. But if you want to do good in the world, even while purchasing from an evil empire that shall not be named, please buy Tamara's book. That would be a good way to do it, and at least to buy good stuff from the evil empire would be good. Anyway, and again, all that information is in the podcast description. But I want to sink down into some of the interpersonal things that you speak about, and then I'm going to come back up to from the interpersonal expression of things like reparations back up to some of the bigger level things, which of course you and I as individuals can't solve, but we need to get it out there and talk about. So one of those interpersonal things took place at in the Carolinas as you sat with descendants of the Taylor family. So take us to that scene. What was going on? Who were the Taylors? Why were you there?
Wow. So surreal. I say this often when I talk about that experience. It was an experience that I will take with me to my grave. And I say that only because, I needed to experience Dr. Taylor's hospitality. There were people when I shared, particularly my family, that I'm going to spend the weekend with the family who enslaved our ancestors.
Right. And there, just for the listeners, the Taylor family is the family where Tamara's ancestor, Renty, Papa Renty, and others were enslaved. And so you now are sitting down with the descendants of this family. Yep.
And and one of the pictures I have, I captioned that the sons and daughters of former slaves with the sons and daughters of former slave owners. But I was connected to Dr. Taylor through a young woman named Rose Schreiber who lives in Columbia, South Carolina. Someone I happened to meet on the internet who was a godsend for me. But she provided me with his telephone number. And the reason why I wanted to talk to him was, again, I'm working on this huge genealogy project, the piece my
years of research and work. Yep.
Yes. And I knew that my enslaved ancestors were dispersed amongst the children of the slaveholder. Also knew that in order to find where my ancestors landed, where they staked their roots, I needed to find where the Taylors were.
It was intertwined.
Yes. So I needed to find someone who had insider information as to who these people were, where they were, and specifically where they lived, and just anything I could find about the Taylor family, a prominent slaveholding family. And what I also learned in the research and in the genealogy, it wasn't just a family. It was a slaveholding dynasty. These large families with significant wealth who were marrying their children off to other large families with significant wealth. And that wealth all came from the institution of slavery. I found this woman, Rose, who actually one evening provided me with the telephone number for Dr. Edmund Taylor. And I had been saying to her, Rose, I need to connect with a Taylor descendant. I need, there's so many pieces of this puzzle that I need to have filled. I need to talk with a descendant. So she got the number for me and I called. And I dialed that number without thinking.
Okay.
Just calling someone's number. And then as the phone is ringing, I'm thinking, okay, now what are you going to say?
Right.
And
you hadn't scripted this out before.
Just jumped on the phone, waited for this moment, this opportunity to speak with him. I just started dialing without thinking. And then when the phone rang, I started getting nervous. I worried that perhaps they might be, these were the descendants of the slaveholder. And I did not know what their perception, thoughts, or feelings were
going to be. Yeah.
And so I'm like, okay, how are they going to feel? Are they racist? Are they, are they good people? Who, I don't know who I'm calling.
Yeah. Do they feel terrible about the past? You don't know.
I don't know. And the other thing that I knew and that I felt now this is something that happens typically when there's a news story about my case and people might come on with a hateful message. And for some reason, I don't know why that bothers me. And I try to dismiss it and not give hate any oxygen. But what it does is it takes me back. I usually have to step away and rebuild before I can get back into things. Yes, so it is hurtful. And when I encounter those experiences, I sometimes have to step back and take a break. And so I'm thinking, if they're going to be rude to me and hurt my feelings, this is your back. What are you doing?
Yeah.
And so I didn't know what to expect. The phone rang, and a young lady with a kind, soft-spoken voice answered the phone. And I'm thinking, okay, this is a good sign. And I start babbling. You don't know me. My name is Tamara Lanier. I'm working on a family genealogy project, and I need to find descendants of Benjamin Franklin Taylor so that I could piece my family together. My family was owned by Benjamin Franklin. And I'm babbling. Yeah. And the woman, ultimately, she said, you would need to speak with my father. He's 98 years old and hard of hearing. Like, oh, no.
Yeah.
So I wasn't sure what his capacity was. Was he alert? He was 98 years old? Was he healthy? I didn't know, but I felt in that moment that it might be a dead end. But it was anything but. Dr. Taylor was witty. He had all of his wits about him. Very, very, very aware. Memory sharp as a tack, remembered, and would reflect back on things from years ago. And he was hospitable. He was a perfect host. During the conversation, he offered me an opportunity to come to Columbia to meet. And I'm like, I'm on the next plane out.
Okay.
I was very excited about that. I ran out to my girls and I said, girls, we have an invitation to go and spend the weekend with the family, the descendants of the man who enslaved our ancestors.
Right.
And they looked at me as if I had 8 heads. They were like, are you crazy, Mom? What are you talking about? You don't know these people. How are you going?
Yeah, you're crazy. What are you doing?
What are you doing?
Yeah.
I knew I had to go. Knew that this would be an important part of this journey. And I just had to build myself up in the event that this would be a disappointment. I was ready and willing to face that in order to get what I needed, and that was information. And so, but everyone that I talked to was very warm, very inviting, and seemingly excited to have this conversation. So I was excited also.
Sure.
I went to Charleston. I went to Columbia, South Carolina. I went by myself. My girls still would not go.
Yeah.
I connect with Rose, the woman who actually made that contact possible. She came, and we went to his home. And I remember walking into what I could only describe as a feeling like I'm walking into a time capsule. They were, he and his wife were in their late 90s.
Sure.
Their home was, maybe I think the best way to describe it was historic.
Okay.
His home was a celebration of his ancestry. He had historic pictures throughout the house of his ancestors.
Okay.
I recognized some of the names when there was one in the dining room where we ate. Her name was Sarah. I remember because one of the unusual things about his ancestry and mine, my ancestor Renty named all of his children after the Taylor children. And there were Benjamins, there were Sarahs, there were Marys, there was Williams. These were all Taylor names. George, those are all Renty's children's names. Yeah. So I remember sharing that with him. Renty named, and this naming tradition continued beyond slavery. So they didn't have to do it anymore, but they continued. I really don't understand that. But I think that was a big icebreaker for our conversation as well.
But if I could I apologize for interrupting, but here, I can't even imagine what it would feel like. You're in the process of trying to get pictures back of your ancestors. You're now in a room viewing the pictures of the ancestors of this descendant of enslavers.
Yeah.
And you're seeing his ancestors.
And fighting for mine.
And fighting for yours. And so if my audience can just try to put themselves emotionally in that place, that's why I wanted to pause right there, was just to highlight that. So please continue. I apologize.
Yeah. And along those same lines, Dr. Taylor, when we sat down to eat, he shared that you are eating from the dishes that were owned by Benjamin Franklin Taylor, and that you're sitting at the table and chair of his. These table and chairs were hand carved by the Taylor family carpenter, and so that was a whole moment for me, and I'll tell you why. And I talk about God putting information at my fingertips and giving me access to information, and how I come across that makes no other sense other than God opening these doors and making these opportunities for me. But I had gotten a hold of the Taylor family slave index. And what the index does is it identifies the slaves, and I see all my family. It gives a value, what their worth was.
Oh my goodness.
Also, it identified them based on their I don't want to say their what role they played, like cook, carpenter.
Yeah.
But one of the things, for one of Renty's children, he was identified as the carpenter, the Taylor family. Thompson.
One of Renty's children.
Yes. Yeah. And so I'm like, when he said this, I'm like, oh my God, I'm stuck in this moment. I'm still talking, but I'm not able to think about anything else or allow myself to, say anything else, because I'm stuck in this moment where the woodwork in the room that he said the carpenter, family carpenter, the chairs are better than the chairs that are currently in my dining room, of its sturdiness and stoutness. the sophistication of the woodwork and the mastery of the carpentry. I'm like, oh my, and I was just so proud in that moment because my enslaved ancestor, with his limited resources,
right,
crafted all of the woodwork here almost 200 years ago,
yeah,
and it still stands.
yeah,
It was just a moment of pride for me.
right.
And I was just trapped in that moment. I was so proud to say, this is something that my enslaved ancestor made out of nothing.
Yeah.
And the beauty of it. And, I often think now when I think about it, Dr. Taylor and his wife have since passed away. And I know how they valued Benjamin Franklin Taylor's dishes. And they were beautiful, the beautiful dishes.
I'm sure they were.
Wonder if they valued that woodwork and the that table, that chair, the gazebo, all of the woodwork in the same way.
Yeah. And it what it does for me, I'll just put this out there. I talk with people of my complexion pretty often about some of these things, and sometimes the pushback I get is that I keep hearing that somehow we benefit and we're more privileged and we're starting from a higher spot and all that kind of stuff and blah blah blah. But actually, and they're resisting that, right? Because nobody wants to think that they had a leg up, right? But in a way, this picture of those chairs is, here's a family descended from enslavers, and they're still benefiting, generationally benefiting from and the generational wealth, as well as just the metaphorical thing of sitting on a chair someone else built that was enslaved and built with quality and pride and artistry. And I think you're right to feel pride for that. I mean, yes, absolutely, and it should be celebrated. But then acknowledging that, you know, there there are whole generations that are sitting on the benefit that they've received from, literally sitting on that, in this case, the benefit they've received from enslaved peoples and the whole history of enslavement. So I just think when we come back to talking about, making America great, I think this is, and truth telling, I think this is one of those pieces. And I just felt like it's a powerful metaphor. It's also just real, right? It's literally happening, but it seems like a metaphor of bigger things.
It really, really
Yeah,
is.
it's a very powerful story. And that's one reason I wanted to start there. There's another instance where you talk about an encounter with the descendants of another figure who looms large in your book. And as you and I have had interactions over the last months, you know that I've been particularly, what's the word I want? I was about to say attracted to. I'm repulsed by this guy, but I feel like there are aspects of his story that need to be more publicly known, and that's Luis Agassiz. And Harvard professor, big figure at Harvard, famous scientist, still admired and revered in the scientific world for scientific methods, etc. Primarily zoologist, glaciologist, Swiss, comes to America pre-Civil War, gets into bitter battles with Darwin. I'm just painting this picture for our listeners. Advocate of polygenesis. So yes, people of other races and colors are human. Thank you, Luis, but inferior. And he set out to prove that through all sorts of things. His name gets put on all sorts of things at Harvard and mountains and institutions and schools all around the world, right? So all of that's in the book, my friends. Please go buy the book and check all that out. But there's an encounter you mentioned in our last interview, and it shows up where you actually meet with another set of descendants of his family and lineage. What was that like? What happened there?
the way my attorney framed it, he said, we are two families forged together by history.
Mm-hmm.
I think that couldn't have been more well said.
Mm-hmm.
I consider Marion and Susanna Moore as sisters. We talk regularly. I talked with Susanna last week. We have vacation together.
That's amazing.
Louisiana with Marion. Well, this is the backstory, which I think is for context important.
Sure. Yeah.
When we filed the lawsuit to recover the cultural property of my enslaved ancestors, it made the front page of the New York Times. And Marion Moore, who lives in Minneapolis, saw the news story.
Okay.
And so she sent me a message on Messenger. But remember, as I said earlier, when these news stories break, there's a lot of good and there's a lot, of ugly.
Sure, it stirs up all sorts of responses. Yeah,
it does.
Hate. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So at this point, it was kind of overwhelming, and I'm like, okay, I don't need these apps. I'm going to delete them because I can't go through.
Okay. Yeah. Your mental health, right?
Yes, yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And I see this message, and I open it, and it was from Marion. And she introduces herself as, she said, you are the great, great, great granddaughter of the man named Renty. And I am the great, great, great granddaughter of Louis Agassiz.
Good, man.
So, and she goes on to explain, she is very apologetic because she very open.
Like right out of the gate, she's
right
so it's not like the Taylors where you don't know what you're going to get, right? Yeah. This is like, here I am. Okay. All right. Yeah.
And at first I'm like, okay, is this a troll or is this real?
Mm-hmm.
Look for the Agassiz descendants. I was, I was curious as to who they were, what they thought. Now, their ancestor had horrible views about race. And, there was a part of me that was concerned that, some of this hate might have been passed down generationally to his children. So I was like, do you really want to find these people? Again, trying to protect my mental health and my sanity. I'm like, do you really want to go down this rabbit hole? And so I stopped. And so when she reached out, I was skeptical because, firstly, social media being what it is, and all their silly messages.
You just never know. It's bizarre. Yeah.
But then there's a part of me that says, take this message at face value and respond.
Okay.
And I did. And, and again, a moment that I will never forget. We both had chills talking to each other. Firstly, because of the irony of what was happening in that moment, that we had connected. The other thing that I found so profound was the Agassiz that descendants are completely opposite of everything Louis Agassiz stood for.
Okay.
As he was, the proponent of Black hate, they were proponents of Black Lives Matter. They were doing the work. Also not only with on causes related to Black social justice, but Native social justice. I was invited into an event with the Agassiz family. It was a Native American tribe in Nevada, I believe, where the local government had removed the name of a tribal elder and renamed this part of the community after Agassiz. And so it was high school students who took up the campaign to say, no, you have to return this tribal elder's name to this landmark, and ultimately they won. But so we were a part of that, and I was excited about that.
Yeah.
But we've done phenomenal things. But what I can tell you is they are completely opposite of everything Louis Agassiz stood for.
Yeah.
And not only that, but they were willing to put their works behind it in there.
Yes.
What can we do?
Yeah.
And they traveled to Cambridge, Massachusetts. The descendants, 43 of them, pinned a letter to Harvard, because at this point, Harvard, the daguerreotypes, Louis Agassiz donated them to us. They're ours from the Agassiz family. The family came together and said, "Give Tamara the daguerreotypes." Of course,
for my audience, again, you'll find this in the book if you get it, but the daguerreotypes are the pictures. I've been using the kind of generic term. It's a particular type of photography of that period, and of image capturing. I'm using pictures just to kind of keep it simple, but yes, the daguerreotypes is the real word. So thank you, Tamara. Yeah.
And of course, Harvard never responded to the letter, but 43 descendants. There, and it was so beautifully developed and well written, and not only that, but they traveled to Cambridge, Massachusetts, and hand delivered it. Brenton Bacow, who was the president at the time, was not in his office, but they did deliver the letter to him.
Right.
And so Harvard never responded. Harvard then began to say, as opposed to saying Agassiz daguerreotypes, then they became Zeely's daguerreotypes.
Yes, Zeely was the actual photographer for our audience's benefit. Yep.
But yeah, wonderful people, and all of them are living a life of service, giving back, building up, and and what Marion said to me. And she was very apologetic, because she said for years she had heard that there was some dark part about Louis Agassiz and his perception of Black people, but she never really looked into that until she explained in the newspaper. And they acknowledged their ancestor was a part of something that harmed so many people. Felt they had an obligation to try to right that wrong. Yeah.
Well, and there, I have my own strategy and agenda in trying to bring up the Taylors and the Agassiz descendants and these two encounters you have, because for me they are both kind of paradigmatic of ways we can respond to truth telling and how we face our past. And in a way, I think I see four big ones. One is, of course, we can, as white people, we can simply bury it and remain in racism and hate, etc. And we certainly see that very present in America, and encouraged, unfortunately, in some political circles. The other is we can do these performative, yes, it's terrible, we acknowledge it was bad, et cetera, and then pat ourselves on the back and feel good. But these two represent, one, we can simply ignore the fact that we benefit from the privileges of having, whether it's generational wealth or simply advantages because of, in my case, not just my white skin, but my maleness, which of course is a whole other aspect of advantage and privilege in America. But the other, and so the descendants of the Taylors kind of represent that kind of genteel, polite, how can you not like these people, and yet, right, not actually facing the issue. Your encounter with the Agassiz, that actually, their descendants, that actually fills me with a lot of hope, and I think paints a picture of the kind of thing that could happen, not just individually, but perhaps on a bigger scale in America if we face the past. And
that is what the Agassiz descendants did. But it also made me mindful of I knew that I was exposed to and was experiencing generational trauma caused by what my relationship with the Agassiz taught me is that is not exclusively a Black experience. That there were white people who were looking in their family trees and finding distressful stuff and not really knowing how to deal with it.
Yeah.
And like Marion said, we can either run from it or move towards it. And I think that there's this paradox where people are currently experiencing, and no one is talking about this, but very real. And there is trauma for not just Black people, white people, anybody doing this work, looking into their history, finding these god awful things and not knowing how to reconcile that.
I'm really glad you mentioned the kind of generational trauma. It's one of the things it's kind of like I had an inkling it might be there in my subconscious as I began the podcast, but as I've been talking with, representatives of First Nations descendants and the episodes just prior to when your two interviews will launch, talking with someone kind of going back to the history of indigenous peoples in what's now Southwest, Mexico, United States, pre-Spain and all that, your stories, as I talk with people from LGBTQ communities, women, young women especially, and who've tried to operate in professions, and the trauma that people experience, who are quote unquote other, which is a dangerous term to use, but from a particular frame of reference that looks more like me, they are other, right? And there's trauma. What I'm hearing you say, which is also helpful, there's trauma everywhere, actually. But I don't want to say that in such a way to diminish how important it is to handle the trauma the way the descendants of the Agassi family did. Yes, they too had trauma by discovering all this stuff. But it wasn't just about them, and it caused them, in this case, to actually, as you said, live whatever phrase we want to use, life of service, but address it with action. And it's just a very powerful example. And man, if that could just multiply, right? Yeah. Well,
like I said, there is not even a willingness to have this conversation because no one wants to talk about slavery.
Yeah.
But what it was very clear to me that this trauma that I knew I was experiencing was not exclusive to the Black experience, and powerful, much needed conversation.
Yeah. So this kind of begins to segue. We've talked a bit about the reconciled relationships. That's kind of at a interpersonal level, but it had bigger impacts with your encounters with the descendants of the Agassiz, of Luis Agassiz. And it has, and we've talked a bit about the issue of erasure of history, which the solution to that is the recovery of history and truth telling, and let's get all these things back. As you said, though, institutionally, with the Supreme Court kind of siding on a number of things, it's going to take time, but we've got to do that. We've got to tell truth, even if it's just history, right? Like cold, hard facts. But this begins to touch on kind of the final big thing that I want to begin to explore a bit, and we can't solve it all. And it's the question of reparations. And in some ways, your story is a microcosm of an example of reparation. The story of the indigenous peoples in Nevada that the descendants of Luis Agassiz took part in, and that was a recovery, and it's a kind of reparation. But there has been a lot of thought about this, and I don't know what happens to you when you bring it up. When I bring it up in my circles, it's typically like, well, that's just not possible. We can't do that. It's not my fault. Why should I have to do something, et cetera, et cetera. But there's been a lot of thought, and actually America has inadequately, I would say, attempted reparations in various settings. There's things that they did for families of Japanese Americans who were interred during World War II. I would say inadequate, but at least there was a step towards that. For some reason, it feels like when this is brought up in relationship to enslaved peoples, formerly enslaved, descendants of formerly enslaved peoples, it seems like the resistance bristles and strengthens to any talk of reparations, small scale, individual, or on any sort of bigger scale. There was a conference your book mentions in 2017, and Ta-Nehisi Coates, I think, was one of the speakers there and has also written on this issue. But could we just sort of talk about what his views of these things were? And I don't even know where to go with the conversation, Tamara, but I want to, we can't just close the podcast without saying the word reparations and asking some questions. It would be really, what's the word I'm looking for? It would be very
we have to have
irresponsible. That's the word I'm looking for. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, and so now the conference that Harvard had in, I think it was March of 2017.
Yeah,
it was billed as a conversation related to universities and their legacy of slavery,
right.
And the question of reparations. And Ta-Nehisi Coates was to be the keynote. And so I was tagged on social media. Someone shared this event with me and said, "Hey, are you aware of this?" And of course,
right.
And I also had been told by Drew Faust that if there's anything that's going on about with the daguerreotypes, certainly they'd keep me in the loop. They'd keep me apprised. I didn't know anything, so I reached out and I said, "Hey, I think the conference was either the next day or maybe the next day after, but it was imminent. It was about to happen, and I knew nothing about it." And I reached out and I said, "I'd like to go. I'd like tickets for this event." And they first said, "You can't have tickets. It's oversubscribed. There's no room, blah." And I didn't accept that because they had promised to include me in things, and they weren't.
I mean, we'll make sure you know about anything going on in relationship to this.
Exactly. They did the complete opposite. So, after a little pushing and shoving and back and forth, they gave me first one ticket. I said, "I need two because my daughter's coming with me." Ultimately, I was able to get 2 tickets, and I went to the event. And I remember the first thing about the event, we didn't know what was the purpose, whatever. We're just going. We walk into the lecture hall, and the image of Papa Renty was so big, so all-consuming. It stopped in our foot track, in our track.
You're in a battle to get the rights to all this back, and here it's being used. Yeah.
Yes. Just it filled the entire room. That image was just big. And I'm like, oh my God, just stopped and, at the same time, just were dumbfounded. And by this time, Harvard also knew who I was, story. They knew the legacy that I had reported it in so many media outlets. It was a well-known story by this time.
Yeah, you were well into the battle.
We were, and so we find our way. We find a seat in the back and sit down. And from the moment the conference began until we actually walked out, it was nothing but gaslighting and the cognitive dissonance. Again, we don't know who Renty is. A lot of what we know is conjecture. We've they completely discounted everything that I had said, everything that I shared with them, and we're telling a whole different narrative about who these enslaved people were. And so I'm like, oh my God, blown away. But then, so I'm telling my daughter, this is a waste of time. We should leave. But we agreed to stay to hear Ta-Nehisi Coates speak. And so when he presented, he was very, very clear. He said, that these universities, particularly Harvard, and he was not mincing words. He was very clear, benefited enormously from slavery, and you have an obligation to make reparations. He said, I think every one of you universities has a duty to pay reparations. And it's funny because he was the only one in that conference about reparations, talking about reparations.
Right.
Everybody else was dancing around the issue and patting themselves on the back for the work that they did, which was gaslighting, and for the false pretenses they were sharing about what their commitments were. And so it was just a conference of gaslighting. And so we ultimately, at the break, we decided we'd leave. But what also happened, and I write about this in a book, and I think it's very, very telling. Harvard had a hashtag for their conference, which was streamed internationally. And if you wanted to comment from anywhere in the world, you could comment by using this hashtag. And it was Unislavery was the hashtag. And back then it was Twitter, and you could tweet. Yeah. So my daughter's sitting there bored, and she starts tweeting some of our story on this this international hashtag.
Okay.
And people start lighting up her phone, and her phone starts pinging. And she's telling me, Mom, she says, look, Mom, look at all of these people responding to my tweets.
Yeah.
So you start tweeting too. Start telling Papa Renty sorry. And so I do, and my phone starts pinging. I'm sharing pictures. I'm sharing images of Dr. Taylor and us sitting together and us talking. I'm sharing news articles of the news coverage about the story. And and with the picture, that's where I put the hashtag sons and daughters of former enslaved, with sons and daughters of the former enslavers. And, so, our phones just started lighting up, and we're responding and we're tweeting. And at the intermission, several people came up to us who had seen the tweets and said, are you Renty's? And they were outraged as to why Harvard did not acknowledge us, did not acknowledge that there was a descendant of the man that was the focus of this conference in the audience, a descendant who had an oral history that defined this man. One gentleman who happened to be a Harvard alum and law professor. Was he a law professor? Yeah, I think he worked at UNH, not UNH, but he was a Harvard alum, and he was responsible for bringing Black studies and Black programming to the Harvard University in the late 1960s, early 70s. And he said he knew some of the organizers, and he's going to write them a letter. The very next day, he sent me a copy of that letter, and he was like, he really chastised Harvard for their treatment of us. And he said, were you aware that there was a descendant of Renty in the audience? And, she wasn't acknowledged, but she knows who this man is. And I strongly encourage you to reach out to her so that you can have a fuller picture of who this Papa Renty was. Of course, no one ever reached out to me, but so that was the conference. And we walked out of that conference. In that moment, I knew that despite everything I had tried to offer Harvard in terms of information as to my lineage, information as to who these people were, they were not interested. They were only interested in telling their story as they saw it. Yeah. And they did not want to hear from me or the truth. And that's when I knew that I had, I had to find out what my legal rights were. Yeah. But the question of reparations, as it relates to me, and then again, I write about this in the book, restitution and reparations. Yeah. And when I talk about this, I say, let's break down the word of reparations and what it means. Mm-hmm. the intent of this word is. It's to repair, and where, restitution, also making a victim whole, is specific to a crime, an act where someone is injured, and how the courts have an obligation to make that person. Reparations speaks to a more global, a more historic or age-old harm.
Yeah.
That we now, in this moment or in the present, look to reconcile, look to repair, look to make whole of a systemic age-old harm.
Yeah.
And how we go about doing that, there is a precedent, because this country, as we have talked about before, has paid reparations over and over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is, when they have made reparations in the past, it's something that happens. There's no debate about it. There's no polling about it. You just find out it happened. When slavery was ended, reparations was paid, but it went to the slaveholders because they lost their slaves. And nothing went to the enslaved people.
Yeah.
And so, historically, there has been so much to there's so much that I could point to say reparations. My attorneys called it the R word.
Yeah.
Radioactive, but the country has paid reparations before, and it wasn't the R word. It just happened because they knew that the right thing to do.
Yeah.
And this animosity about righting age-old wrong, for atoning for what the United Nations has called the most egregious act of inhumanity in the history of the world.
Yeah.
It seems to elude people, and that, for me, it fuels racism, because we look to other aggrieved groups and see the need to right this wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Comes to the descendants of American chattel slavery, there is not even a willingness to have that discussion. And you have to ask why.
Yeah. And you mentioned a few moments ago that it's kind of at this global level, or reparations generally is a kind of global big concern. And in this case, literally, because what's now the United States was involved, England was involved, multiple European nations were involved, Arab trading and slave traders were involved. There were different peoples within Africa involved in the whole process. And there's responsibility kind of spread all over the place, but it is something we can do if we had the willpower. Post World War II, there were forms of reparation. Europe even helped Germany rebuild, right?
Yes.
So it's a question of just the will, and again, the truth telling and the willingness to face things, and a desire to actually do the right things.
I know, like, one of the things that I learned is in 2016, I believe it was legislation that President Obama passed, later supported by President Biden, but it was the HERE Act, the Holocaust Expropriated Art and Recovery Act. But what we did in this country to acknowledge the harm of the victims of the Holocaust and their descendants, certainly a needed and necessary measure.
Yeah.
But I ask, and this is an atrocity to happen on foreign soil, but the monies that were set aside to support these families, the legislation that bent the law to make it possible for descendants of victims of the Holocaust to recover their cultural property. I often say, if I were a Jewish woman, I would not have to have sued Harvard. There's legislation that says give her back her property.
Yeah.
And so it boils down to equal protection. If
it is, yeah.
Yes. the need for this aggrieved group to be made whole. Why can't we, for the worst, the most tragic incident of genocide, the worst tragedy in the history of the world, can we have the discussion about repair, and truth and reconciliation,
and face the reasons why we haven't faced it, right? Like there is a racist root to that we just need to face, and for some reason people feel like, oh, you're just trying to make us feel bad. Oh, well, it starts with feeling bad. Yes, absolutely. I mean, but that isn't the end result. And this kind of, I'm gonna segue to some concluding things here. So just for my audience's benefit, and if you get the book, this will be very obvious. But Tamara is a person of faith, and particularly in the Christian heritage and Christian tradition. I these days refer to myself as a pre-Christian Jesus follower, because I really want to sort of get to the roots of the real person and follow him. I don't know about you, Tamara, but in my own social media interactions, I often get hate about when I'm talking about protesting or taking part in a No Kings rally or something like that. Well, there's only one King, Jesus, and my standard response to that is, yeah, and actually it's the kingdom of Jesus that I would like to see, which is rooted in the Sermon on the Mount and humility and righteousness and truth and honesty and transparency and self-awareness and openness and justice and all of those things. And we've been talking about that. And, you experienced that in your encounter with the descendants of Louis Agassiz. Whether they would count themselves as people of faith or not, that was operating. That kingdom was in operation.
Yes.
And that's what we're talking about. And the reason I'm bringing it up here is not even really about you or me, but we're in a season. Part of this whole America at 250 thing coincides with a rise of Christian nationalism and wanting to make America a quote unquote Christian nation in a particular brand of Christian faith that, to me at least,
is not Christian.
it feels so far away from Jesus and the kingdom he would bring that I have cognitive dissonance looking at that and thinking, this is not, no, I don't want that. So anyway, I don't even know why I'm bringing it up at the end, except to just say I do hope for a better day. I think there's a lot of hard work to get there. I'm so glad we were able to cover some of the stories in your journey, because I, again, think that your journey has been like this extended metaphor of what could happen to recover and make restitution to some extent. I don't think you really got full restitution by any sense. And just for my audience who can't see, she's agreeing with me on that. And reparation. And we can do this. We have the moral ability and the moral will in us if we will exercise it. I just really appreciate your contributions to this conversation, Tamara. And if you have some concluding remarks for my listeners, I want to give you the floor here for a moment.
Well, I just wanted to share, there was one more moment
Sure.
that I think just speaks volumes as to my journey and just the favor that God has shown me in this decades long journey. I, at a certain point early on, had difficulty getting my story out. And that was only because Harvard was telling the media, there's no way she can prove she's Renty's lineal descendant.
Right.
No way, that, she can, and there's nothing to document, what, there's no way she can do this. There's no story here. They've also killed stories that were potentially ready to run. And so I, one morning, was on my way to work, and I happened to be watching the morning news, and there was a segment on about an event that was happening at our state capitol, where an enslaved man by the name of Mr. Fortune was being buried after 200 and some odd years. His bones, he was an enslaved man owned by a doctor. At his death, his skin was removed and his skeleton was preserved.
Mm.
So what happened, children, and it's always children who shame adults. And
Yeah.
but children went to the museum, visited the museum, and they saw the skeleton, and it was supposed to be about biology and science. But what they learned is how the skeleton came to be, and they were shocked.
Yeah.
So they started a writing campaign, give Mr. Fortune the dignity of a proper burial.
Wow.
And ultimately, the museum relented and agreed to bury Mr. Fortune, and he had a state burial at the state capitol, a beautiful event. Like, not, I saw so much of my story in that story, so I said I had to be there. Yeah. I called my boss. I said, look, I'm going to be late. I got to go to Harvard. I'm going to be at this event. And so I go there and I sit down next to a woman who I've never met before. I know nothing about her. And I am, I start sharing with her the story of my Papa Renty and my battle with Harvard and how they were killing the potential news stories. And, that I was just frustrated and I didn't know what to do. She grabs me by the hand, complete stranger. Mm. It turns out that she was a history professor at the University of Pennsylvania. Mm. And she grabs me by the hand and she said, come, let's go to Mr. Fortune's casket and pray. And so we leave where the ceremony was. The casket was in a separate room where only she and I were. And we went in the room. I placed my hand on the casket. I prayed first that this man's soul could finally rest in peace. And grateful that the world now knew his story and he is given the dignity of a burial. And I thank God for that. And then I asked God to give me or send me a reporter who has the courage to tell the story over Harvard's objections and who would tell, the story on a larger scale so that my story can break through. And I opened my eyes. Remember, we kind of sneaked away to this private space. I opened my eyes and there was a reporter who was taking my picture. Mm. And he said to me, firstly, he asked if he could have our name and permission to use the picture. And I said, absolutely. And then he asked, if you don't mind my asking, what did you pray for? And I was like, you. I was cool. And so I share that all to say that, I am not unmindful of how God made a way for me out of no way, how he opened doors, how he created opportunities for me. My story was at a dead end and needed someone who had the courage to tell this story over Harvard's influence. He not only told the story, but he did a feature story. It was like a 4-page story in the largest newspaper in Connecticut, the Hartford Courant. The Associated Press picked up the story and it went viral. Mm. So I just share that all to say how God is moving in my life and making it. I prayed for something. I opened my eyes and there was my prayer.
There it was. Well, let me use that as kind of a segue to conclude, because my listeners may not be from Christian backgrounds. I might have Muslims listening and Jewish friends listening and Hindu friends listening, etc. But however, listeners, you may understand the divinity and the divine and grace and life. Tamara's story is a story of a divine hand at work, and if that can happen in a story like hers, those of us who are people of faith, in however you relate to the divine, asking for this to happen in America, those same kind of miraculous, serendipitous, astounding connections can happen. This can happen because we're not alone in it. Again, I think this is something that, as a Jesus follower, Jesus would want. And so let's ask for America to actually be truly great. Future episodes, those of you who are listening, we're gonna visit with descendants of Chinese immigrants to ask what it's like to be in America for them and kind of the broader Asian experience. I'm going to be talking with what it's like to be a Muslim immigrant in America at this time, and with all the rhetoric around that. I'm going to be talking to a young woman in corporate leadership. What's it like to be in America, and much more. So please stick around and go back and listen to the episodes you haven't yet, and stick with me with these weekly releases. Tamara, again, thank you so much. I'm so grateful for your time and for your book.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Like I said, I appreciate this opportunity because, again, it helps me have my story reach people who otherwise might not know or hear the story.
Yeah, thank you. And so those of you listening, please share with others and let them know. And buy the book, From These Roots, Tamara Lanier. Information about it will be in the podcast description, and we'll see you next time. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Maybe someday in America, another day in America, maybe someday in America.